In the 1980s, the beat-em-up genre exploded into arcades everywhere. From the classic Kung Fu Master to its many clones, beating down bad guys became a celebrated pastime for millions of kids across the globe. When I played Renegade in 1986, it completely redefined my expectations for these types of games. Not only could you punch and kick, but you could grab, throw, and even beat your opponents while they were on the ground. Technos Japan had crafted a title that took the martial arts action seen at the movies and turned it into a video game that felt very different from the titles before it. Technos Japan would then take that formula and create one of the most popular beat-em-ups ever, Double Dragon, the following year. It was, in a word, spectacular. It had two-player co-op, epic music, an unforgettable opening, a dramatic ending, and more of the gameplay that had made Renegade so fun and unique. It wouldn't take long before newer games would lessen its draw and appeal, but for a few years there, Double Dragon was a juggernaut. Naturally, home conversions of the arcade were highly anticipated, and it showed up on just about everything. The NES got a classic rendition that played pretty good, but it lacked the two-player co-op mode. The Master System version played quite different from the arcade, but retained the two-player co-op. Heck, even the Game Boy got a conversion to call its own. All these ports had huge concessions when it came to the visuals, however. For that reason, I was pretty stoked to play it once it was announced for the Sega Genesis. I was expecting near arcade perfection, and nothing less would do. But we didn't get just Double Dragon on Sega's 16-bit workhorse. We also saw its sequel, Double Dragon 2, yet another sequel in Double Dragon 3, and the two spin-offs, Double Dragon 5 and Battletoads Double Dragon The Ultimate Team. That's 5 total games in the series, and in this episode, we are going to take a look at each of them, see if they lived up to my expectations, and talk about whether you should play them today. Hope you guys enjoy Double Dragon and the Sega Genesis. You would assume I'd start with the first game, but believe it or not, Double Dragon 2 was actually available before that. Released in late 1991 as a Japanese Mega Drive exclusive, this was developed by Quest and published by Palsoft. I'll be honest here, I didn't know this game existed until years after its release. When I found out about it, I had visions of two-player co-op goodness that would bring home the arcade perfectly. I have no clue what happened, how it happened, or whose fault it was, but this pile of garbage left me in a state of complete shock. From the moment it begins, you are bombarded by pathetic visuals that seem more at home on the Master System and sound effects that are distorted and overly simple. But it's the gameplay that dooms this port as an unrecoverable mess. There is a constant intermittent slowdown and speed up to the flow of the action, almost as if the code being executed is about to lock up the entire time you play. The hit detection is also terrible. Punches and kicks go right through enemies half the time, and your attacks can hit them well outside the sprite and even interrupt their attacks. Once you get a feel for this awful gameplay, you can actually exploit it to the point where there is no challenge at all. Even on hard, you can wreck the game with no issues. It scrolls poorly, the animation is unimpressive, the color is drab, and it's exceptionally short. A play session to the end is little more than 20 minutes. What should have been an extremely fun arcade port you could play with a friend ends up being a night of disappointment and sadness. The only things here that aren't a complete failure are a couple of really good songs and the fact that you can turn it off. Truthfully, take my advice here and never cut it on in the first place. My very first experience with the series on the Genesis was indeed the original Double Dragon, though it was released in 1992, a year after the second game, and developed by Software Creations and published by Ballistic. Funnily enough, This is actually an unlicensed game and does not carry the Sega branding anywhere on the packaging or in the game itself. I went in expecting so much. The Genesis version would surely see the arcade home to perfection. The original was old by then, and the Genesis already had better looking games with larger sprites, better animation, more impressive backgrounds, and gameplay that was faster and smoother. Apparently the developers didn't understand that because Double Dragon is an unmitigated disaster. Like before, the gameplay is outright broken. It's entirely too fast, with strange bouts of slowness in your attacks, and any successful strategy basically hinges on you exploiting a couple of moves and abandoning the rest. This is tough, because Double Dragon didn't have a lot of moves to begin with. It just feels so erratic that I have a lot of trouble playing it. Sometimes I feel like the game isn't doing what I want it to, and the poor hit detection makes it all the worse. Even though this is short and accepted by many to be easy, I can't stand it long enough to see it to the end. You have to understand that this was released after the first Streets of Rage, and even though the original Double Dragon was never going to compare well with that, the fact that this is notably worse than expected really makes this travesty a tough one to stomach. Add in some really rough music, and it's just not something I'd recommend, even just to try it out. Its visuals are better than Part 2, and it does have 2-player co-op, but all of that takes a back seat to its massive, experience-breaking problems. Say what you will about how the Master System version played, but it's way better than this letdown. This was 5 years after its arcade debut, and if anything, we should have seen numerous upgrades, not something that would make Altered Beast seem like a masterpiece of game design. By the time 1993 rolls around, I had completely forgotten about the Double Dragon arcade franchise. With 2 incredible Streets of Rage games out on the Genesis, Final Fight out on the Sega CD, and Super Double Dragon exclusive to the Super Nintendo, I just didn't care anymore. So you can imagine my hesitancy when I saw Double Dragon 3, the Rosetta Stone, had made its way out to the Genesis thanks to Software Creations as the developers again and Flying Edge as the publisher. I gotta admit, the sheer power of morbid curiosity drove me to see how this turned out. I mean, surely without question, they couldn't possibly release another terrible Double Dragon, could they? Turns out they could, and this is the worst of the trilogy. The arcade version had added a new shop, where you could buy different characters to use, power-ups, weapons, and even extra moves. This is retained in the Genesis port in an attempt to bring the series some modern sensibilities, but no amount of added content was gonna save this nightmare from ruining your evening. Right from jump, the arcade version was already terrible itself, so in order for this to be any good, the developers would have had to have redone the entire game. Nope. Instead, they tried to mimic the arcade and somehow ended up with something even worse. Stun animations are either missing entirely or so fast that the enemy recovers and attacks you before you can respond yourself. This makes for a frustrating mix of being knocked down constantly and having to use the same strategy over and over in order to succeed. Playing this after Streets of Rage 2 is pretty much impossible. Your muscle memory had been exposed to gaming nirvana, and subjecting yourself to this atrocity will leave your reflexes rebelling against you. Presentation-wise, some of the music is okay, some of it is terrible. The graphics aren't what I'd call bad, but the simple animations take a toll that just makes everything seem so dull and uneventful. All of this is really a shame, because there is a great variety in the levels and enemies here that goes well beyond any game in the series before it. Had it actually played well, this could have been something to talk about, but ultimately, it's just another bad beat-em-up that fails on just about every level. In 1993, Rare scored the Double Dragon license from Technos Japan and added it to their Battletoads universe. This became Battletoads Double Dragon: The Ultimate Team. Despite the cooperative nature of the theme, this is a Battletoads game first and foremost. Rare developed versions for the Nintendo, Genesis, Super Nintendo, and the Game Boy, and largely, they're mostly the same. This is built around the gameplay you've come to love, or in some cases hate, in other Battletoads games. You choose either from the 3 Battletoads or the 2 Double Dragons, and face down enemies and bosses from both universes. Levels offer an impressive variety of traditional belt-scrolling style action, vertical rope-repelling combat, obstacle-based vehicle sections, and even some unexpected shoot-'em-up diversity to really change up the pace. Like I said, the core gameplay mostly feels like Battletoads, in which you beat down the bad guys with exaggerated attacks, throws, and finishing combos. Jimmy and Billy have a few moves of their own, such as jump kicks, but they largely feel similar to what the Toads are doing. This is actually not a terrible game overall. Heck, compared to how bad the other Double Dragon games were before this, it's a friggin' masterpiece. The variety in the attacks and the stages give it an identity all its own, which is more entertaining than the standalone games on which it's based. It also has some fairly decent music, but don't go run out and score a copy just yet. This game still has issues you should know about. While the opening 2 stages are fairly easy, it gets considerably more difficult later on. Some enemies can kill you in just a few hits, and those spaceship stages can be a real pain. So much so that defeating it legitimately will be reserved for only those of you willing to invest a fair bit of time and effort. The 2-player mode goes a long way to rectifying this difficulty spike, so be sure to grab someone for the journey. While it's no Streets of Rage or Final Fight, you can still have a lot of fun here. Curiously, this was only released in North America and Brazil. (1994) would bring us the last entry into the series, Double Dragon 5: The Shadow Falls. Developed by the company behind the Super Off-Road games, the Leland Corporation based this one on the animated series at the time, and made it a one-on-one fighter. With Street Fighter II on fire and seeing numerous copycats, it was no surprise at all that a genre change was in order for a franchise in desperate need of retooling. So how did it turn out, you ask? Well, compared to other fighters, it's pretty damn shallow. There's really no combo system to speak of here. Each hit hammers the opponent and leaves them out of reach of additional hits most of the time. That leaves the special attacks as your only real entertainment, but these are mostly useless as well. They tend to be slow and easily avoided, making the lack of a competent combo system even more glaring. It's also slow as molasses. The developers did try and make an RPG-like stat system for the fighters. This allows you to use points to make your defense, strength, and special attacks more effective. I found this interesting at first, but it doesn't provide much depth. There are also fatality-like overkills in which you finish off your opponents at the end of the match. These depend solely on who you are fighting and not something specific to your fighter. There's also a bit of blood for the Mortal Kombat crowd. Ultimately, both the point system and the overkills end up not being enough to help this lackluster experience. So shallow are the core mechanics, I found that just pumping all your points into strength and finding a standard attack that hits more often than not was more than enough to conquer the story mode. I can't say I blame Leland for trying a new genre, but they really needed to do their homework on what was needed to make these types of games enjoyable. It must have failed miserably because it was only released in North America. After 5 showings on the Genesis and Mega Drive, Double Dragon was finished. Its arcade release had earned it some respect back in 1987, but by the time 1994 finished up, the IP had seen better days. This was truly a shame because the Technos Japan developed Super Double Dragon showed the IP still had legs and could still put asses in the seats. Sadly, Sega's platform never saw a port of that, and was instead cursed with the subpar arcade ports and spin-offs. I find it almost hilarious that the best Double Dragon on the Genesis wasn't a Double Dragon at all. Battletoads Double Dragon The Ultimate Team is your best bet for having some fun with the Lee brothers. It has a number of issues itself, but is so much better than the other games in this episode, it really is night and day. Honestly, I had enjoyed the Double Dragon games on the NES, and to see them fail so miserably on my favorite 16-bit system was disheartening. This was made so much worse by the fact the other beat-em-ups had been so much better. Streets of Rage 1, 2, and 3 were orders of magnitude more impressive experiences, and once you added in the likes of Hyperstone Heist, Splatterhouse 3, Golden Axe 3, and Comic Zone, there was absolutely no reason to play any of these Double Dragon games, other than the Battletoads outing. Double Dragon's time had passed, and these Genesis efforts had failed to reinvigorate an ailing franchise in desperate need of something special. I'm Sega Lord X, thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.